All right, hello and welcome to the Path to Government Employment presentation and panel discussion. I'm Dr. Victoria Hightower. I am with the History Department, and also I am the Assistant Director of the Nationally Competitive Scholarships Office. Thank you all for coming today. And I want to introduce our panel. We're going to give the panel a little while to speak, and then at the end you all can ask your questions of the panel that you have about government employment. So, the first person to speak is going to be Dr. Dlynn Armstrong-Williams, who joined the college in 1997, and she's the head of political science and international affairs. Her areas of interest are comparative foreign policy, international relations theory, as well as East Asian politics. Our second speaker today is Dr. Craig Greathouse. He's the associate department head for political science and international affairs. His specialties are security, defense, European politics, and affairs, and he arrived here in 2007. The last speaker that you all are going to see is Dr. Edward Mienie, and he is the director of the Security and Strategic Studies program here at UNG. He joined in 2005, and his areas of specialty are international relations, intelligence, the politics of Africa, and comparative military systems. So without further ado, I'm going to send it over to Dr. Williams.
Thank you, Victoria, and thank you guys for joining us today. I really appreciate you taking your time. When I was asked to talk to you today, I was asked to discuss a little bit about the type of students that we've had that go into governmental service, their background, why they chose their careers, and essentially where they went from there. So let me talk to you a little bit about what a life of public service is about. And I'm so excited that you guys are interested in this topic and this idea, because governmental service in many ways is an act of service, and it's service for the state, service for the government, and service essentially that will build, we hope, of course, better and more effective governments, particularly internationally. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that and a little bit about some of the unique pathways that some of our students have taken to get those type of positions, and the things that they've talked to me throughout the years about what they did well and what they didn't do so well. So, but I'll try to be as succinct as possible. So the first thing is I want you to understand that each step that you take while at the University of North Georgia is a building block, right? And it's a building block to the next step. No one gets a job working for the Directorate of National Intelligence or anything else immediately out of undergraduate, right? So this is a step-by-step process where each of you will build a portfolio that you'll later use to market yourself for whatever career that you choose, okay? So what are the building blocks that go into this portfolio, and kind of how did the most successful students do it? So one of the things is it depends, of course, on the major you choose, but I would like you to consider a major that tries to give you experiences above and beyond the norm. Those experiences above and beyond the norm that we really encourage in the Political Science and International Affairs Department are study abroad and international internships. Now, the reason why we wanted you to do that, and we want you to do that really as succinctly and as quickly as you can, is that, as I explained to students, you are building yourself almost as a product. You are building yourself as what you're going to market yourself as later. So, for example, I advise a lot of political science East Asian majors. And I say, listen, I said, if you want to study Chinese, which I'm a big fan of, if you want to study Chinese, that's wonderful. I think it's great, but then you have to consider, are you going to market yourself as a sinologist, which means somebody who focuses just on China, or are you going to try to market yourself as somebody who focuses on all of Asia? If you're going to do all of Asia, then all of your experiences can't be purely Chinese. It depends on what you're trying to do with your experiences. And so with students, I talk a lot about that because sometimes they're overwhelmed, which I completely understand. With a difficult language. Because I do Asia, it's often Chinese or Korean, often it can be Arabic based on the student, and they become so focused on the language that they forget the other elements that will also help make them competitive. So while language is very important, and I would never downplay that skill set, there are other skill sets that are also very important, and those important skill sets are your ability to live and work in another country. So we were very blessed when we put together the international affairs major that we brought in recruiters from the CIA and other intelligence, we'll say, organizations to ask them, hey, what do you think about the construction of this? And for them, the internship was incredibly important because it proved that a student could be abroad 5 weeks on their own without being surrounded by other Americans and perhaps other college students, and in that embryonic environment of higher ed, and they could get to work. They could get a bus, they could make it to their position, their job, and they could get back. They could shop for groceries, they could blend in. If you cannot be that independent, then it will be very difficult to teach you the later skills that you might need later for a future career in government if you're interested in those fields. So because of that, what I want you to think about really is what kind of governmental office you want to work for, what type of candidate you want to be, and if you want to be essentially a Swiss Army knife or you want to be a surgical, right? As you come out of undergraduate, mostly we're all Swiss Army knives. It takes a while to become that surgical blade. And so because of that, you have to think about the foundation you're setting. The only other thing that I think is important to talk about for my students that have gone through this process is to be very aware of how you are marketing yourself. And what I mean by that is you market yourself not only academically, but in what you're doing in social media, what you're doing where others might see. And this becomes very important, particularly if you're looking for a position with a security clearance. Probably everybody in this panel has been the references for numerous security clearances. I know I have. And the reality of it is that a lot of questions they ask are pretty probing. And these probing questions are often some things that I might not know as a professor, but that means they're asking other people as well. So just to let you know a little bit about my own security clearance, when I went through the security clearance process years ago to get a secret security clearance, I was shocked. They went back to my hometown, which I hadn't lived in 3-4 years at that time because I was an undergraduate. They asked next door neighbors that I barely knew. They asked who I was dating. They asked if they knew if I had ever gone out drinking. Was there any conversation of alcohol abuse? They asked very detailed questions of everyone. Did I own money to anyone? Was I going to be beholden to anyone? And I just want you to be prepared for that if this is your choice, right? They asked if I had ever been involved in protests, if I was ever involved in anti-government activities. The level of scrutiny that you have is pretty deep. And so because of that, I just want you to be prepared for that reality if that is the career set that you want to go through. Now, the only last thing I want to tell you is this is often not a linear path. Students rarely go in a linear path where they graduate with a 4-year degree and then immediately go into governmental service. In fact, only one person that I've ever dealt with actually went into the State Department immediately from undergraduate. And that person had a very unique personal story and had lived in Africa and was bilingual, and there were a variety of reasons why that person did that. Most individuals have to have other levels of education and life experiences. And most of our students who are working in intelligence, both military intelligence at the DNI and other areas, they have gone through a lot of different life experiences. And they have worked for example, the UN, they've worked for the US Council of Mayors, then they end up working for State Department. So there's a variety of pathways that they take to that end goal. So I won't take too much more time. Thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity to speak.
Thank you, Dr. Williams. That was really great. Dr. Greathouse, you're up.
Okay. My name is Craig Greathouse, and I was asked to speak today about some of the organizations that people look at, especially when you're talking Boren and Gilman and some of the other competitive fellowships. They want you to work for a national security organization when you finish. One of the things that most students don't know is the institutional structure and what these different organizations are looking for. And that becomes incredibly important when you start to think about going into these types of careers. Most people think of the CIA. Clandestine operations, basically the deployed agents, there's very few of those. Most of what they do is analytical positions. So I went and looked this morning. They've got listed positions: economic analyst, military analyst, multidiscipline analyst, political analyst, analytical methodology. And when you start to look at these different things, they're looking for very specific skill sets in each of those areas. So just because I'm in political science, I do security studies, I pulled up the qualifications for a political analyst. They have to have a bachelor's and master's degree. They have to have at least a 3 out of a 4-point. But remember, these are nationally competitive. Therefore, a 3 is the bare minimum. You're going to have kids that are running close to 4. And you're also going to have kids coming out of some pretty high-end programs that you're competing against. So you need a decent GPA. They always say strong critical thinking and problem-solving skills, but it's deep regional or functional expertise in the region, especially traveling to the region, especially residency in the region. So if you're an IA major or security studies major who's done study abroad, who's done the internship abroad, those things help there. Awareness of US national security interests. And just as Dr. Williams said, language is an important element, and they do have that down. But if you only take language and you don't understand a region's history, its political structure, the influences, the strategic elements, you're not competitive. If all you can do is language, there are roles for that. But you cannot effectively compete for some of these analyst positions. And you will never be able to compete for some of those analyst positions. You have to understand what's the role of the CIA versus the DIA, which I'll talk about here momentarily, or the NSA, or how do those work with Congress? How do those work with the general bureaucracy? What's the relationship between State Department? What's the relationship between Department of Defense? You know, you're not getting onto National Security Council when you come in. You have to build. You have to build a resume, which means starting at the bottom usually. And if you go into government service, you're talking an entry-level analyst position, unless you've got some very significant background skills. Now, if you are former military, that opens up certain doors that you may not be able to get into. If you are a civilian student coming out. And there's just certain things because of certain clearances you need, certain basic fundamental understandings that you need. But when you're starting to talk about going into some of these agencies, especially an analyst position with the CIA, and pretty much across the board, they want good verbal and written skills. They want you to have an analytical capacity. For students that have gone into this that I know of, they've been asked for papers. You know, so if you're, and let me be blunt about this, if you're out there hunting and pecking for what is the easiest path I can do and how can I avoid certain faculty because they make me write, it's going to hurt you trying to get these positions. You need to be able to show you have critical thinking and analytical skills. And if you don't, you're not going to be competitive for these jobs, because a lot of people want these type of jobs, because once you get in, then you're in that structure and you can move into things like consulting or jump back and forth between the government and private consulting. Say you get a job with the CIA and then eventually you get into Booz Allen, all right, which is one of the biggest consulting firms in DC, or RAND. You can make a lot more money, but you only got there because, well, you were in the CIA, or say you did NSA. I don't know if anybody in here right now has a scientific background, but if you do, the NSA may be the place to look, because they do a lot that is more of a scientific background. They do have intelligence analysts, they do political analysis, but that's not their focus. They do a lot more on the technical, the cyber side. All of that comes out of NSA, National Security Agency, signals, things like that. Whereas you also have the Defense Intelligence Agency, where that is pretty specifically focused on military type assets, elements around that. The other thing, if you start to say, well, I get a lot of kids coming to me, I want to be a foreign service officer, I want to work for the State Department. You have to understand how competitive that process is. You have to test multiple times before you even get a possible interview. And they only take X number of people a year. And if you are not in the top 1 or 2 or 3%, you're not getting a slot as a foreign service officer. You have to have a deep background. You have to have complete understanding. Even to get an analyst position in State Department, it's incredibly competitive. So you can't just limit yourself, and this builds on what Dr. Armstrong-Williams talked about. You have to have the language. You have to have the history. You have to have the political analysis. You have to have a critical thinking background, so theoretical, and understanding of how you process information. All of this becomes vitally important if you're trying to get these jobs. And the one thing I will tell you, go look at these different agencies. They actually tell you what they want. They tell you their qualifications. And then you have to be realistic. Can I check the boxes? Because if you can't check the boxes, don't waste your time with the application. Because if you can't meet the criteria, you are not going to get the job. And that's the biggest thing when you start to look at these types of organizations. You have to have that background. And it can't be, well, what is the easiest way I can get a good GPA? Those classes aren't going to help you get to where you have to be. And then I'll leave it there and we'll deal with any questions later. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Greathouse. Always sunny. But last but not least, we have Dr. Mienie. Take it away.
Thank you very much. My name is Mienie, and nice to meet you all virtually. I am going to speak to you more from a practitioner's point of view. I spent over a decade in the diplomatic service, and my last posting was Deputy Ambassador for my country. And so when we look at government jobs, I can assure you that you're not in that kind of work for money. It's really a calling, as I'll tell my students. So, you know, be sure that as you go into any government job, that you are doing it for public service and not to become rich. You will be comfortable and you can retire comfortably, but you're certainly not going to become rich through doing that job. And I think that's a very important point to keep in mind, because you are going to have tough days where you may question whether the money that you're earning is worth the hassle that you're going through. So you need to have an open, sober mind as you consider going into public service. Building blocks that you need to consider to position yourself for work, whether it's in the United States intelligence community or whether it's in the Department of State. Things like, are you good at working with people? Clearly, you're going to be working with people unless you are a highly skilled technical person where you're going to be doing an analysis and you're sitting in a room and you've got very little interaction. That's a different story. But generally, in the intelligence community, working with foreign cultures would be highly valued. And to Dr. Williams' point, our study abroad, international internship arm of our degree programs is very important. It's to set you up for success for those who are interested in these types of careers. You need to be competitive. What does that mean? High GPA. Many people seek these positions and they're competitive. A bachelor's is bare minimum. I would highly recommend, if you're serious about this type of work, diplomacy and intelligence, that you can strongly consider doing a master's degree so that you can become more competitive. You certainly need to know what's going on in the world. Your application process would start with an online application. They'll go through your qualifications. They will then weed out and thin out the field and then invite those who they want to interview to an interview. They're going to become quite specific. They want to find out whether you are going to be worth their investment of time and money to get you ready for a career to represent the country, or that you are teachable within the intelligence community. Because once you make it through the door and you're in whichever one of the 17 official intelligence agencies that make up our intelligence community, you will then be schooled and you will go through a lot of training so that, as Dr. Williams was saying, you can become that laser blade. We mentioned this before, a clean background, as clean as possible. People make mistakes and that's fine, but these agencies will know everything about your background because they do. I held a top secret clearance, and you can rest assured your references that you put on the paperwork as you apply is just the tip of the iceberg. They will interview people that you've never even thought of about you. So that's a consideration to keep in mind. And a very important one nowadays is your personal brand. How is your personal brand being influenced through social media? What are you posting on social media? Because if they are going to call you in for an interview, rest assured they've already done their homework and they've made a decision based on what they find out on the social media platforms, who and what they are interviewing. So keep that in mind. Psychometric tests is another building block. So you've got the degree, you've applied, you've gone through the interview, everything is looking good, and then they do psychometric tests to establish we all have cracks in our makeup, right? So it's a matter of establishing what the nature of that is, and are you susceptible to being bribed, or do you have a weakness that could expose and pose a threat to national security interests? This they do via psychometric tests. And then of course your background, you need a security classification. They're looking for well-rounded people, right? Are you adaptable? Well, going abroad shows that you are adaptable. So let me go into the different disciplines that would be appealing to any of the agencies that we are talking about today. Law, business, international affairs, political science, languages, cyber, intelligence. All of those are attractive to any one of those agencies. Ever thought about the Treasury Department having an intelligence division? So that's an important division within Treasury for a very important reason. State Department. State Department has a Bureau of Intelligence and Research. Performs a very important function in support of our diplomatic efforts abroad. So we are happy to have Strategic and Security Studies, which is an interdisciplinary degree program, because graduates, as we face, as a nation, face a multidisciplinary threats. We value students who can think across disciplines and not in silos. So that's our aim, our drive with our Strategic and Security Studies program, if I can make a plug for that. Getting into the intelligence community, applying online is generally the way to go. If you are serious about it, speak to individual faculty who may have individual connections that can pass along a resume, so you can get personal attention that way. That's also a possibility. I think I'm going to rest there for now, Vicky, and I'm available for questions.
All right, thank you all so much. I'm really grateful that you all emphasize this idea of students being well-rounded, of thinking about that sort of building block path within UNG, and then once students leave UNG, and how can we help them become mindful of that path and of their personal brand, and also thinking about the idea of interests and are you a human, right? And how do you show your humanity as you're running through school and not just sort of a one-trick pony? I think those are all really great tips, and I'm grateful for you all for talking about that. So students and audience members, do you have any questions? Come on.
I had a question.
Thomas, go ahead.
I think it was both Dr. Armstrong and Greathouse that were talking about you need to be able to show analytical skills, and one of the things they ask for is like previous work and papers. And I was just wondering, like through the resume, are there certain like tactics, if you will, to help like show your analytical capability, and besides just like submitting work? How do you advertise, I guess?
Part of that, when you start to build your resume and they start to look at the classes you've done, if you've done an internship, right, and in your letter, your letter's going to be an important thing. If you've done an internship and you had analytical requirements within it, be sure to highlight that. Or if you list it and you have to talk, I did this internship, and you say, here's the duties. Okay, so things like that is a way to show analytical capability. If you're in IA, or we have the senior paper, capstone paper, that should be a pretty good representation of you as analytical capabilities. If you do a master's, then you've got some more options for things like that. But it's not just something, I have analytical capability. They're going to look at that and giggle, okay? You have to be able to have evidence to support your contention. So internships and jobs you've held or things like that, anything that shows that you can do critical thinking, analytical thinking will play. But you're going to have to show those job duties, and you're going to have to be able to support it if somebody asks a question.
Thomas, I also think it's helpful. So for example, in some of the classes that you've had, to itemize a little bit, I'm talking about in one line, what those classes actually covered, right? So just because you might have a course, we'll say on international political economy, you're going to want to highlight if you talked about global value chains and global supply chains and stuff like that. Just enough, not a lot, but just enough so they know what that really was. So I would encourage you to do that. Now, where I think the knowledge part really gets caught is, at least for Department of State, is on your first test. They're going to give you a test, and on that test, they're going to ask you questions that are uniquely focused on, were you exposed to this in the classroom elsewhere? So, for example, they might refer in a question to the Fertile Crescent. They're going to have an assumption or an understanding that you are going to know what that was. And it's sort of an embedded knowledge almost that you can't read up on that, right? You can't be like Googling constantly as you're doing this. So because of that, it's the tests that you take are really going to look at kind of phraseologies and questions and kind of common knowledge based on a region of study. So if you say you know a region, they're going to test if you actually do know the region. And it's going to come up in the test, at least for Department of State. After you get through that test, because the test is global for Department of State initially, after you get through that test, then you get stepped into the interview process. And I'll be honest, for me, what really helped was I had an internship with Department of State. And that really, of course, helped my knowledge a lot.
Great answers. Thank you all. Eddie, do you want to talk?
Sorry.
Yeah, I saw one of the questions here in the that's being typed up. I just want to be clear based on the nature of the question. The FBI does have an intelligence division. After 9/11, there's a big debate whether we should establish a domestic intelligence agency, and the FBI fought tooth and nail to keep that within the FBI. So that forms part of one of the 17 agencies that make up our intelligence community. Also, there's a question here about what kind of domestic intel jobs are there. I mean, you look at Homeland Security, they will definitely have that capability. The FBI does have that. NGA, the National Geospatial Intelligence Community, do a lot of work here domestically. NSA that was mentioned earlier. There's the Department of Treasury. There's the Department of Energy, critical infrastructure. We need to protect that. They have an intelligence division as well. So that's just to mention a few domestic opportunities for those who are interested in the intelligence path.
Great. Well, speaking of some of this, Raul asked, what kind of volunteering and internships would be adequate for this type of employment? What you all know far better, I think, than I do. So.
Am I muted?
No, you're fine.
No, you are
Right.
now.
So sorry. So one of the things that we've seen, to be totally honest, is that there's a huge importance of cross-cultural understanding. And that sounds all touchy-feely and gooey, but it really isn't. The goal is that it takes a lot to understand a culture. And it's substantially more than understanding the language, right? So I remember my language professors telling me, well, if you dream in the language, that's your first step. And if you joke in the language, that's your next step. And I was like, oh my goodness, I'm never going to get there, right? One of the issues for internships that we tell students is we want you to have cross-cultural experiences. We want you to work with individuals from that region of the world so that you do feel the tension, so you do feel the uncertainty. Like, I don't understand. I was hired as an intern to work on political science processes. I'm an Asianist. And so why am I mopping the floor before the convention? Like, you're like, what am I doing? Well, partially that's going to become cultural understanding. You understand your place in that organization much more clearly, and you will understand that culture and how they value hierarchy much more clearly through those experiences. And so I think that as when you talk about internships and what should I do and where should I volunteer, even if you're going to do things domestically, I would strongly suggest that you volunteer in some kind of cross-cultural environment where you're going to have that tension. So we encourage people to volunteer with the International Rescue Committee in Atlanta if you want to do something domestic, consulates in the area that are here representing their countries or their regions, international businesses. I have had students who interned with Haverty's and others, so they were negotiating contracts, so they quickly realized that yes was not yes, and that becomes very, very important. Concepts of time and time to production and how that works are very, very different culturally. So we want you to experience that tension and we want you to experience that pressure. And those would be places where I would encourage you to intern or volunteer.
All right. Vicky, sorry, go
There
ahead.
are other questions, but just keeping with this topic, I would like to say that nationally competitive scholarships, we help you find money to go abroad. And having these internship experiences domestically can really help you make the case for why you need to go abroad. So, you know, going abroad is very important, but not everyone has the money. And so if you don't, number one, come talk with us at Nationally Competitive Scholarships to see if we can find a scholarship that will help you achieve that goal. But if not, you can always work here in the US. And the more that it looks inevitable that this is what you want to do, the more skills you're building with every experience. And I think that that's something that we've been talking about a lot, and you should all keep in mind. Now, the next question, I think that hit on some of the others. Charlie, I will say that any advice, there's a question that says, any advice or thoughts on applying to the FBI Honors Internship Program? Do you all have any tips?
FBI, what I would talk, there's a couple of faculty in the CJ department, and they deal a lot more with the FBI because it is a domestic law enforcement. They do have some analyst positions, but if you're looking to know more about that one, there's a couple individuals in CJ that you may want to see if they, or there used to be, and see if they can give you more information on that.
Any ideas on who we should talk to?
Tim Hayes may not be a bad contact, and the new department head, you can talk to him and he can point you in the right direction.
Yeah, Doug Orr.
Yeah.
Dr. Orr.
Dr. Orr, yeah. Great. So the next question is the in-country intelligence jobs, and I think we did that. Now, there was a question about, for Chinese capstone, we're required to spend a year abroad. Within that year, we have to intern at a Chinese or a Taiwanese organization. Will that compromise my security clearance, or will it provide experience for federal government and intelligence?
If, depending on the organization you intern for, it should help you. There are some organizations that the federal government may look at to be, if it's an organ of the Chinese government, that may not help you. They're going to look very closely at that. But if it's an NGO or something like that, or something connected to Taiwan, it's not going to hurt you. But they're going to look at any time you spend overseas and the organizations that you look at. So when they do the security clearance, they're going to get into that fairly deeply, just so you know. But if you get invited to do something, with the Chinese government, and you eventually want to do a top secret clearance, you may want to rethink that.
Yes.
And of course, talk with Dr. Chen or Ms. Chen about this, but also remember that the capstone is funded by the government, the US government. And so that's also something to keep in mind. They're not going to completely jeopardize your experience. Sorry, Dlynn, were you going to talk, or Eddie?
No, that's all right. I would encourage you, it depends on what your goals are, more towards Taiwan. And let me explain why. What I did not know, honestly, until I'm a Korean specialist. And so what I did not know until I got very, very deep into the South Korean bureaucracy was that some organizations that appear to be very much nonprofit organizations were actually pretty heavily funded by the government. And not on their public reporting, nothing else. I literally had to get into the national budget and then start questioning people within the bureaucracies regarding how they were funded to show a particular level of collusion between a trade organization and the government itself. Now, I'm telling you that not because it's a bad thing that they were colluding. Colluding sounds bad, but the issue is that in Asia, the state and the government tend to be much more interwoven into business. It's not unheard of. It's closer to the norm. So because of that, you have to be very sensitive. So if you essentially go on their webpage and it says on their webpage they're completely private, be careful because the level of that can be very difficult to determine, especially if your language skills aren't up to the height it's necessary to make those determinations.
Dr. Mienie?
I agree 100%. If there's a choice between going to China or Taiwan, I'd lean towards Taiwan. The Chinese intelligence services have a very interesting approach for a young college student who compromises him or herself. Nothing gets done about that until they assume a very senior position within the US government, and then they pull the card. That happened 20, 25 years ago. So I would definitely strongly consider doing an internship, international internship, or a program in Taiwan if I had a choice.
Great, thank you all. Now switching a little bit to military, what opportunities uniquely exist for ex-military personnel? And then kind of related to that, are there civilian positions at the DIA?
Yeah. You want to go, Eddie?
No, go ahead.
Okay. For DIA, there are absolute civilian positions. Now, depending on where they are in the hiring cycle and the budget, there'll be entry-level positions, and that's what you have to get into. If you look at their employment that's up now, most of the positions listed, you have to be a DIA employee right now to get those. But they do have entry-level civilian positions. In terms of military, there are specific positions for former military. They will have those in State Department. I've seen it for CIA. I've seen it for NSA. A lot of times for state and CIA, it's in their security divisions because they're looking for a very particular set of skills. Some of that may also be in the Clandestine side, but they're looking for somebody who's been fully trained in the use of weapons and things like that, especially for their security directorates. But a lot of times for ex-military, what the advantage you get is you may have held a secret security clearance because of your position in the military or something like that, and that will help. You also get points when you start talking about federal employment, because a lot of times there's a point system at play, and the more points you have, the higher in the pool you are. So I think there's a significant, I know there's a significant bump for ex-military.
Yeah, generally, I'd like to say as well that if you have a military background, you'll be good not only for government service, but also for the private sector, because you project certain values and disciplines which have already been proven as a result of your military career. So it stands you in good stead. So you have a leg up, in my opinion.
Hey, I think the other addition is the great news is if you get a security clearance through the military, then the private corporation doesn't have to pay for one. They're interested in saving money just like any entity. So if the military has already vetted you, and we've talked kind of a little bit about how extensive any security clearance is, then you carry that with you, and then it's evidence that you've already passed at least that level at that point. So that then they know they have a better idea of what they're hiring, which is helpful. The other question though was, about the civilian question. And I think the question for civilians is, I do not have prior military experience. That was not part of what I did. My experience as a civilian was, however, that I had to overcome a couple things, right? The first thing we talked about, of course, is GPA. My GPA was really solid. I'll be honest, I had a 4.0 in my major coming out of undergrad. The issue was, however, is that my internship with state did not occur until after my undergraduate was completed. They were so competitive that by the time I essentially got to the internship through state, I had finished my undergrad, and it was a bridge experience between undergraduate and graduate school. Back to what Victoria talked about a little bit earlier, understand that this is a long-term build. This isn't a build that you're going to accomplish in 4 years with UNG and then go and just essentially coast for the rest of the way. This is a build that's going to essentially go from UNG to some experiential, hopefully things in your resume, to master's programs, etc. Because why I took the internship with the State Department and why I applied was because I wanted to use that as a lever and for leverage when I applied to graduate programs. So if I had the State Department internship, I thought it would look better if I applied to graduate programs. The graduate program I chose to attend They later told me that the reason why I got a completely full ride to graduate school was because of my GPA and the State Department internship. These things build on each other. And so I want to encourage you to essentially cast a wide enough net so that you can utilize these pieces like Lego blocks to essentially build your resume however you need to at this point in your career.
Great. We have a bunch of questions here, but for those of you who need to run off to class, you all are welcome to go, but we'll probably stay on for a few more minutes just asking questions if that's okay with the panelists. Is everyone okay until 11? Yes, thank you all. So the next question we have is forensic social work. What can I do with that degree in the federal government, and what competitive internships would be good for that degree?
I don't have a background in that, so I can't give you any guidance there.
Me neither. It's a good question, Mari. I would probably suggest talking with your faculty.
Right. I would talk to Sarah Mason, the chair of HSDA. One of the things is that it's great. She might know former students that she can help connect you with if in case they pursued that particular unique subset of a social work degree.
Thanks. All right, so the next question is, if you're unable to obtain a security clearance, how limited are you in getting a government job, and what are your options? How critical is public sector position for getting a private sector position?
If you can't get it, if you're rejected for a security clearance, that's where it's going to be an issue, because that's going to come up at some point in the future, especially if you're trying to go higher up. But there are entry-level positions that do not need a security clearance. For example, an open source analyst, in many cases, is not looking at sensitive documents. They're looking at generalized things that are out there in the public domain that are on the net. For that, you're going to need strong cultural background and also some language skills. On the private side, you don't have to have a security clearance to work for some of these organizations and for some of the consulting companies. However, depending on their contract, you may not get into certain areas, because some of the contracts require that you have access to very sensitive information, and you will have to get a security clearance. So if you look at, for example, I'm using Booz Allen, which is one of the biggest in the country, and RAND. For some of theirs, if you actually look at their job ads, they will say security, secret level security clearance or top secret level security clearance required for the position, because they're hiring into a contract where they know you have to have access to certain information to do the job. So there are a lot of positions where you don't have to have it, but as you start to get to some of the more very specific things, you have to have that security clearance. And if you don't have it, you may not be competitive for that job.
That's a good idea. They usually list what you need. So then the next question is, master's degrees and programs, what would you recommend for going into counterintelligence or counterterrorism, both offered at UNG or outside?
I'll give you the idea. I've dealt with our master's degree a lot. I helped create ours at UNG. What I'm going to say is there are a lot of, right after 9/11, a lot of very specific programs came up and were created, counterterrorism and things like that. Right now, you've seen a lot of intelligence programs show up because there was money. Some of those programs are decent, but a lot showed up because there was money available and people created them because they followed the money. A lot of those programs haven't lasted, or they're not going to be viable going forward. For example, the US is transitioning from counterterror to more back to the traditional near-peer competitors. So I would tell you, don't get something where it's so specific you are basically in a funnel, and it funnels you down into a very specific thing. I would tell you do something a little more specific, but look at a program that may have a couple classes in a topic you're interested in, right? So you can show I did some work in that. But go to a program that is actually real. And what do I mean by this? And I'm gonna bang on some of the for-pay places, okay? If every class they offer is in an 8-week semester, it's bullshit, okay? And I'm gonna be pretty blunt about that, because you don't get the level of depth as compared to a more traditional master's program. Or if you go to the PhD route, which I don't recommend right now. Master's is the appropriate level. It will get you the academic criteria that you need to be competitive for a lot of positions. Don't get the PhD because you actually price yourself out or you get so niche. But the master's is the appropriate one. Don't go to some place that's we turn out and you can finish your degree in 9 months. You're not going to get the depth or detail, and you're going to come away probably with a significant amount of debt. Find a decent program from a program that has does normal semesters that can get you the level that you need. General programs are good because most do run specializations. So you can pick up some of those things, counterterrorism or security, or if you want development. And this is where you got to talk to your faculty because they're going to be able to help guide you. Programs that are at better schools play better. If you're looking to do something in Washington, D.C., the Fletcher School is a really, really nice place, but it's incredibly competitive. Georgetown opens up a lot of doors. Again, incredibly competitive. George Washington University, you're going to be in classes with a lot of people that are already in government service, and you'll build a pretty good network. Again, very competitive. Do you have to go to those? No. What you need to go is a good, solid program that's going to give you a background, because all you need in many cases to show you've got a master's degree. But don't go for one of the paid places because
I'm sorry. I know that Eddie can talk a little bit more about the counterintelligence, but I just wanted to speak a little bit about the counterterrorism portion of that question. And just to make all of you aware that there are a group of master's programs that are focused on practitioners, predominantly practitioners who might want to go to Department of State and other areas. This group of institutions is called the APSIA schools. APSIA, and it's the Association of Professional Schools in International Affairs. Craig mentioned the Fletcher School of Diplomacy, Georgetown, and others. They are members of APSIA, as well as Sciences Po, and a variety of schools throughout the world. This network can be very, very helpful for you. And I also wanted to let you know that APSIA has been coordinating with us to try to recruit students into those APSIA schools. The bad part about those schools tends to be cost. They tend to be very, very expensive. And this becomes, I would argue, the biggest barrier to students enrolling in those institutions. But just be aware and ask those questions, because I did as an undergraduate rising. I asked the question, and in many of those institutions, their placement rate could be up 6% in Department of State. If they have a 96% placement rate, that's what you want to do. It could be worth the $75,000 you'll put into the degree, but you need to see that essentially straight up, and you need to make an informed decision. For those of you who go Army, and those of you who rise in the ranks where the Army pays for your education, that is where most of our alumni that come from North Georgia are actually at George Washington, George Mason, Georgetown, etc., because honestly, they've had the Army pay for it. So that's one of the wonderful avenues. There's a lot of pain, we'll say, in contracting and things like that, but that's one of the wonderful avenues that the military can address. So sorry. Go ahead, Eddie.
No, so the same goes for counterintelligence. All those universities that Dr. Greathouse had mentioned are going to have a course in counterintelligence, but really once you are accepted into an agency, they're going to have their own programs on counterintelligence. So it's going to be unique to that agency. So I wouldn't worry too much about that. Just get into any one of these universities that we've already suggested for a master's degree, and you'll be well situated for that.
All right. I want to thank everyone for coming. If we didn't get to your specific question, please email me and I can potentially forward those to our panelists. I would remind you all that Nationally Competitive Scholarships has pathways to government scholarships in some ways. Like there are ways for you to build from a Gilman, if you're Pell eligible, through a Boren Award, a Freeman Asia Award, to a Fulbright, and to some scholarships that even pay for classes and for degrees at the PSIA schools. And those three, we're working with our students right now, some of our seniors and some of our recent alumni, to help them find their way into the State Department, and there are specific scholarships for that. So if you are interested, come talk with me. Dr. Lynn and I have both put our information into the chat box. Come see our critical language scholarships presentation next week, which we'll be having, that will talk a lot about what those are. And the answer is there's a scholarship for everyone. At NCS, we advise for 55 different scholarships. I'm sure we can find one for you. So with that, I would like to thank all of our panelists for your insights and for your time today. I very much appreciate it on so many levels, and it's always good to see you. And to our audience, thank you for showing up. That also really helps. So,
Thank you.
thank you all.